across the galaxy. This is where conspiracy on the wild side meets the perspective of a lifetime. This is the Free Zone with your host, Freeman.
Hello and welcome to the Free Zone. Well, where is the path to the paradigm shift? I mean, is the greatest lie we've ever been told that we are helpless and unworthy? Does science have the answers that we need? I mean, really, how much do we need to unlearn? Heisenberg, Schrodinger, Oppenheimer, and others all found mystical realms through their scientific pursuits. When one looks at society's troubles today, you still believe that elected officials will come in and shift the paradigm for us. Our future is not written. Why do we continue to make the same mistakes that lead to pollution of our resources, economic instability, corruption in government? I mean, is forgiveness the answer? Where is the cooperation? If you are feeling like you've had enough, well, you're almost there. How would you like the world to appear in 20 years? Are you empowering this change? Today we're going to talk with Sherry Swiney. She's a retired civil engineer, but her depth of knowledge goes way beyond that. Sherry has lived a life pretty much unimaginable to most of us, with past horrors and abuse. But this has opened a realm of understanding for Sherry and driven her to create an international human rights organization called the Patrick Crusade. Patrick stands for People Aligned to Replace Injustice and Cruelty with Knowledge. And we are going to talk about reform in all its shapes and forms today when it comes to the self. Sherry Swiney's website is keyholejourney.com. So please welcome to the Free Zone, Sherry Swiney. Hi.
Hi, Freeman. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I was really looking forward to talking to you after our discussion that I had with Jerry Marzinski. And you two have a bit of a past, right?
We do. We've known each other about 20 years, and he's been working in the mental health profession for all those years. And he came to me while I was heading up the Patrick Crusade, and he had a computer program that he wanted to use for rehabilitation for people who were addicted to drugs and alcohol. And so he was looking for an organization that would sponsor him by way of putting his information up on their website. And so I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. So we worked together for many months just putting that together. And then I had a conference to go to, and I invited him to come to Alabama, is where I was working at that time. So he showed up, and we met personally, and I invited him to give a presentation to the group of his program. And so our friendship just kind of took off from there. So about 10 years into knowing him, he would write to me emails about his, I had an interesting patient today. He wouldn't give me the names or anything, and one of them, he was talking about that he wondered if the voices that his patients were hearing were something other than the brain. And I wrote him back. I said, oh yeah, they are. They're dark entities that are invading the brain. And he was kind of at that conclusion too, but timid about saying it because of his profession. And so that opened up a whole new door of the friendship. And so the next thing I knew, he was bombarding me with a million questions. And so I told him my story. And then it was, he just couldn't believe that I had experienced and gone through not voices, but invading thoughts where they're not yours. You're walking, you're carrying on with your day, and all of a sudden some kind of weird thought comes into your head that you would never think of yourself. And that was the first clue that those were not my voices. They're I guess I'll call them voices, but they weren't audible. They were just thoughts, and they sounded like my own thoughts, but I knew they weren't mine. And so, from a scientific background, I decided to study all that stuff, and I couldn't find any information on that kind of thing going on. So I decided to study the brain and how does it work. And I got into that, and it was really interesting stuff, but it had no answers. So then I branched out to self-help books and that kind of thing. And I don't know, I must have read hundreds of books, and none of them had any answers. So I finally stumbled upon a book. I was in the library one day looking for another book to read. And so I went over to the self-help section, and I'm looking around, and all of a sudden this book fell off the shelf on the floor, hit my foot.
Yep.
So I picked it up to put it away, but before I put it away, I opened it up and read a few things, and it sounded kind of interesting. So I took it up. This was at one of the bookstores that has the little coffee shops inside. And so I took it over to the coffee shop area and sat down to read it to see if I wanted to buy it. And so I bought the book and took it home and started reading through it. It was a book called, this was back in the 70s, I think. It was a book called Your Erroneous Zones.
Huh.
And a guy by the name of Wayne Dyer wrote it. I'd never heard of him before. And so I'm reading this book, and all of a sudden there was a phrase in there. Out of the whole book, there was this one phrase that literally turned my life around. It said, you have control of your own mind and your own thoughts, and nobody can make you think something that you don't want to think. And I closed the book and put it on my lap, and I'm like, I didn't know that. I didn't know you had choice. I really didn't know that because of my background. I just didn't know that.
Yeah.
So that was a huge, big deal for me. And so I wanted to know, well, okay, so if I have choice and I can control my thoughts, how do I do that? Because it seemed like an impossible task.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I got to where I am now, of eliminating those thoughts altogether, and recognizing them as invasion thoughts, entity thoughts. And now today I know that they're actual beings, conscious beings. We can't see them. But if you look back in some of the ancient texts, you see some of the traditions where they're called jinn, they're called archons, they're called demons, and that kind of thing. It all starts to make sense.
Yeah, let me throw in there a strange coincidence as well, a coincidence that happened to me dealing with a book that in preparation for this show.
Okay.
It kind of shocked me because I like to dig things out and maybe just kind of suck up some stuff through osmosis. Although I have read all these books, I was just skimming for preparation and thoughts and things. And I pulled out Stanislav Grof, and he is an MD, one of the chief psychiatric research in Maryland back in the 30s. And he's done work on LSD and other psychoanalysis works, and went Beyond the Brain, which is the title of the book, trying to understand consciousness, birth, death, and transcendence in psychotherapy. So I'm going through the Beyond the Brain, and I also grabbed another book, The Holographic Universe, which was written by Michael Talbot. And I was flipping to the chapter on psychoanalysis to kind of, again, get prepped for the show. And, of course, the first thing that I see on the chapter of the holographic model of psychoanalysis is a quote from Beyond the Brain from Stanislav Grof.
Oh, wow.
Talking about the psyche being essentially all of existence, and how powerful the mind really is, and how this fit into the holographic universe. So I kind of had a similar coincidence just pull together, And in the book on the holographic universe, it was talking about Carl Jung kind of coming to this realization that the hallucinations that his patients were seeing were from ancient scripts, from the ancient past. And so he knew that there was no way that his patient had ever come across some ancient Sanskrit writing that discussed the hallucination that the patient was seeing, which was actually a penis coming from the sun. And when he wiggled his head back and forth, the penis would move on the sun and cause the wind to blow. Carl Jung, then digging into ancient Sanskrit documents, found that there was a ritual that could be performed to open your mind to these type of hallucinations, and it was described as a tube coming out of the sun that would wave, and if you moved your head, it made the wind blow.
Wow.
So there are these archetypal forces that have transcended all time, the entire universe, and our mind is the conduit to make this manifest, right?
Exactly. And I didn't know about that story. I read the holographic universe, but I didn't remember that part. But yeah, these entities, I call them entities. Other people call them different things, but I'll just call them entities because that's how I perceive them. I perceive them as living beings who invade our minds, and their primary purpose is to trick us into feeling negative about ourselves, about the world, or anything else, being in fear, and every other level of negativity above that, until you get to the middle part and start going beyond that into love. That's not, they're not interested in that. They're only interested in the lower realms of negative emotions, because when we're energetic beings, we're frequency beings, right? And so when we're in a negative thought pattern, we're actually putting out a negative frequency. And in my experience, that is their food. So they're siphoning this stuff off of us, but they can't produce it on their own. They have to trick us, humans, into having that frequency being sent out from us. I mean, that's what's going on.
Are you familiar with the term maladaptive daydreaming?
Sort of.
Because I find that a lot of people are finding these negative thoughts through that way. And basically, my understanding of maladaptive daydreaming is expecting the worst, always.
Oh, okay.
And so you build yourself up into this whole frenzy. You are now approaching your situation as if you were already in a conflict that didn't yet exist. Because of your maladaptive daydreaming, you've already thought out the very worst possible scenario and believe it's the case.
Yeah, and so you're believing it's the case, and 9 times out of 10, that never happens.
Never. It never. Yeah.
So, you get yourself up into a frenzy, and this is not coming from the individual. This is an implant, because humans are not naturally negative beings. We are naturally very positive beings, and the only reason we're seeing any negativity today on the planet and for thousands of years in the past is because we've been invaded, literally, by these beings who have implanted these ideas into our heads. And they sound just like our own ideas. They sound just like our everyday thoughts. So most of us think, this is real. This is what I'm thinking. This is how I'm feeling. And it's not. It's a trick. That's the big rub. It never was us.
Right. Well,
So
okay.
these maladaptive daydreams, I get that. And we call it worrying. So worrying has never done anyone any good whatsoever. I have a story to tell. My eldest son, the very first time he joined the Navy when he was 18. That was, his father wanted him to join the Navy. So it was his very first time to go on a submarine. And so he called me and he said, Mom, I'm getting ready to go on my very first submarine trip. We'll be out to sea for 3 months. And I said, well, stay safe. And, if you paid attention in all of your classes and everything that you've been going through, I know you'll be okay. And he said, aren't you going to worry? And I said, no, I don't do worry. He said, well, then you must not care. And I said, no. Right. No, that's not the truth at all. I do care very much, but worrying isn't going to help you, and it isn't going to do anything but damage me. So, why would one want to do that? And he's like, no. It's just that you don't really care. You're not really, well, I could die. And I said, yeah, you could, but if you've done your training and you know what you're doing, you're going to be fine. And he's like, oh, okay. Well, he didn't quite get that. It took a few more conversations for him to finally get that point.
Yeah, it makes people think that so people feel as if they worry about things, if they take on all the world's problems and rest them on their shoulders, that they're actually doing something positive for the planet and themselves, and believe that all of this anger and despair and all of it is necessary for them to take in on their soul in order to progress and shift the paradigm, which is completely opposite of what they probably should be doing.
Well, it's a lie. It's a lie that they've been fed, that they've swallowed up. And so when they're doing this, believing this lie, they're putting out this negative frequency and it's getting siphoned up. So yeah, I told my son, I said, if I thought that worrying about you would help you, I would worry myself to death.
Right.
But it doesn't do that. It doesn't do that at all. So, but yeah, that is a lie that people, there's countless lies, unlimited lies that people are hearing or feeling that have been generations old, and they think it's real, they think it's true, and so they act upon it, and they're only feeding the beast, as it were, feeding those entities. That's all it is. I know that sounds simple, and it's not, but fundamentally, that's what it is.
Well, let's go back to the childhood brain. And, dabble in your past a little bit, because so that people understand where you're coming from.
Okay.
But in hopes of kind of giving this a universal appeal, I thought I would use myself as a pre-example, and then you can take it from there.
Okay.
Because, your story is otherworldly in some senses. Most people on the planet would not have experienced the things that you experienced.
Mm-hmm.
But something like what I went through in my childhood, I suffered migraines, and I have most of my life. And in these migraine times, I mean, I'm as sick as you could possibly be. I'm vomiting, I'm nauseous, the headache is just beyond control. And as a child, I would have to put myself into this little space in my brain, and that's the only way I can describe it. And I was safe there inside of that little space in my brain, and basically was in transcendental meditation for hours upon hours as I suffered through the migraine. Now, in that little space in my brain, I felt none of the nausea, I felt none of the pain, but if any moment my consciousness attached to my body, boom, it was there. It was back in, and I would have to try to work myself back to that little spot in my brain where I could hide away from this pain. So this is kind of a universal explanation of what your story is, a massive example of. This is a minor example of how the mind will protect itself by going in, and I can't explain where I went or what I did, but I would go to this place, and there I was safe, and there I felt no pain. And as long as I remained there in this transcendental meditation state at 6 years old, I would not have to suffer the consequences of my body.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. That's a perfect example of just how powerful our minds are, even at that age, and maybe even especially at that age. I experienced something very similar to that in leaving the body to escape pain. And so, as a child, between the ages of 3 to 6, my father was enamored by the Japanese torture methods of World War II, and he did a lot of study on it. He talked about it all the time. And one day, I think I was about 3. One day he asked me, he said, I need to run some tests on this stuff to see if it really works the way they're saying it works. And would you help me? And I'm like, sure, Daddy, that'd be great. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And so what happened was that he would put on his lab coat and get his clipboard, and he had certain things he wanted to try, and he started out slowly. But he used me as his test subject for all of these torture methods. And so the very first one, he said, was the easiest one. And it was putting my arms out to the side, and he put a glass of water in the palm of each hand. And he said, just hold that until I tell you to let your arms down, and don't spill a drop of water, or the consequences will be really bad. And so I'm standing there holding water, and you know how that is, especially if you can imagine as a 3-year-old trying to do this to help Daddy, right? And those glasses of water started getting heavy and heavier and heavier and heavier, and pretty soon I thought my arms were going to break. And I started crying out can we stop? Can we stop? It's hurting, and so on. And he's like looking at his watch and saying, no, not yet, not yet. And so that was the very first one. And that wasn't so traumatic, but you got to remember that at that age, that was the only thing I ever knew. So this just seemed like normal stuff. I was helping Daddy, and it hurt, but that was just the way things were. I didn't know that there was something different. So I wasn't going through any of that kind of trauma. So, but yeah, so the experiments graduated to more and more complicated. And so when they got to the point where they were just intolerable, I accidentally left my body. And I ended up in a place that was like it was like a garden. It was like a meadow in a kind of a top of a hill or a mountain. And it was beautiful, peaceful. There was no pain, nothing. And so I'm standing there feeling good and looking at it. So it was such a pretty place. It just felt like home. And so here comes this Indian chief riding on a paint horse coming toward me. And he comes toward me, he swoops me up onto the back of him on the horse, and we rode off into safety. Well, that ended up being the place that I went every time there was a physical or a mental trauma going on. It just became, just a thought, and I could be there. And so that really demonstrates the power of the mind and what we can do just by thinking about it. At that time, I wasn't thinking about it. I would just go there automatically.
Well, I find the body will just put aside pain or even discomfort. I mean, something as simple as needing to urinate. And your brain will just set it off to the side until all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I got to go. The brain just has a way of ignoring the things. I mean, so often we're in pain, but our body is blocking it from us, and yet there are still effects.
Yeah. Well, my effect, I mean, I can tolerate quite a bit of pain, and I notice that some people do a whole lot better than I do, and some people do a whole lot worse. So I'm not sure what that's all about, but I think when it gets to be too bad, we do tend to escape, and as children, we're really good at doing that. So the thing is, when you're a child, between I don't know how many people know this, so I want to explain this, because the things that go on in our mind, there's a reason that they happen the way that they happen. So between the ages of 0 to 6 or 7, we're in kind of a they call it the theta state of mind, and so that's kind of like a hypnotic state of mind. And we're in that state of mind during that time. So that what that means is that everything we see or hear or experience is basically like a tape recording, a video tape recording. And so we're just taking it in and taking it in. We're not judging if it's right, wrong, or indifferent. We're just taking it in, but we're taking it in as though it's true. So the information that we're getting is going into our subconscious minds, right, for those first years of our lives.
Can I give an example of that, Sherry?
You bet.
Because, I mean, this is the silliest thing, but it's something that I always remember on how we are influenced. And just from my own thing, it was, I believed that you had to slice Irish Spring soap in order for it to work.
Yeah, that's a crazy example, but that's the way, and you actually believed that to be true.
Absolutely, without question. I would have to get out the knife and go cut up my Irish Spring in order to, because if the folks don't know, the old Irish Spring commercials show them slicing through the soap on the commercial.
Okay, that's where you got that.
And so when I saw that, obviously you got to slice Irish Spring in order to use it, right? And that's, our brains, we can't discern between reality and non-reality when you're between the ages of 0 and 6.
No, we're completely impressionable, and this is why, the governments want our children in the public schools so they can be taught the big lies, and then they'll grow up believing it, hook, line, and sinker. You can't persuade
that's not
them.
More clear than today, right? I mean, I don't want to get into the shootings and all of that, but you can see the trigger and you see the effect.
You do, and the mindset of the general population comes from those first years of influence, and everyone has a different kind of experience because every family style is different. Every environment around that family style is different. They have, and this is worldwide. So there's different traditions and cultures and things like that. So when the child is given that information, they're not even given it. They're just absorbing it through osmosis. And it's penetrating their subconscious, and then they think it's real. So this is how they live, and this is what they believe, and this is what kind of sets things off in their lives. So,
and the idea that we are all helpless and unworthy. If you consider what we go through in our institutional schooling, when you go through your different grades in different schools, so when you're in elementary school, you make it up to 6th grade, and you're the top of the heap. You're a kingpin, you're the head of the school, and and then you move to junior high. I had junior high or middle school, and all of a sudden you're back at the bottom. You're back at the low man on the totem pole. Now you're unworthy. Now you are helpless and just trained to be unworthy, and then you build yourself up to the top of that power cycle again, and you're at the top. Now you're in 9th grade, and you're looking down at all the 7th graders, and then boom, you go to high school, you're back at the bottom again, and over again. I mean, from you describing what you did at 3, holding these hands and holding the glasses, to getting through the grades of the institutional school, I feel like I'm watching an episode of Survivor.
Yeah, pretty much.
Never watched this, but
The key word that you said is training.
Right.
or that you've been trained, and we were trained. Each of us was trained to be a specific way, not on purpose necessarily, and not maliciously necessarily, but just because that's how it's always been, generation after generation after generation. And so this is how traditions start, and this is how phobias start, and discriminations start. And I mean, because the silliest thing in the world that anybody's ever put on us is that the difference of our skin, the difference of the color of our skin, actually makes a difference in who we are. It makes no difference in who we are. You've probably thought of this too, or know this yourself, that these are just our earth suits, because we're actually spiritual beings, but we don't know that. More and more people do today, thank goodness, but actually we don't really know that until we get to a particular point in our experience to where we start to realize that, wait a minute, we're not really physical beings. We're actually spiritual beings, being in these spacesuits but we're on Earth, so we'll call them Earth suits, right? Or meat suits, whatever you want to call them. But so the whole idea of implanting discrimination into young people, and they grow up believing that it's true. So this is how we get to where we are today. So the thing is, during our everyday lives, 95% of our life is running on subconscious. Well, the subconscious is that video recorder that got all that wrong information in the first place. So that's how we normally are, because we're running around not thinking about things. 95% of the time, we're just working on automatic, like driving a vehicle. When you first learn to drive a vehicle, you're paying attention to every little move so you can learn it. And once you learn it, you can drive down the road and have a conversation and listen to music and, not even think about all the things that you have to do to make that vehicle run. So that's the subconscious working on that. That's that 95%. So, and until something happens to disturb that, you don't really consciously think about it. So some of the books I've read focus on living consciously rather than unconsciously. So that ties into exactly what I'm saying here about the programming we get when we're so young. We don't know any better. We don't know it's programming. We just think all of that's true. But in fact, it's a program that we're getting from others, not from ourselves, from others. So the way we think didn't come from us. It came from others. Came from your school, your
that
parents.
was the next question, really,
Yeah.
where do our thoughts come from?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. The 95% of thoughts come from others, and those thoughts that came from others, they experienced the same thing. They got their thoughts from others on down the line over the generations.
And this was what we would call a paradigm.
Yeah.
And paradigms shift.
And we're due for a paradigm shift, and I really think that that's where we're headed. And I think that that's why an awful lot of this information that we're discussing today is coming out, and more people are starting to listen, because even 5 years ago, you started talking about this kind of stuff and people were like, you're just too far out there. I can't hear you. I don't even want to hear you. I mean, this is just ridiculous stuff. But people seem to be more open to at least considering that some of this stuff might actually be true. And the ones that actually consider it and try some of the things that we'll be talking about later, they notice that their lives do change, and they get rid of their negative thoughts. And, it's a thrilling moment to know that you actually have control over that. But I wanted to get back
Please.
to this 95% part of our lives that we live through without even thinking about it. It's like it is that videotape recorder programming that we got. It's a literal mind control programming. It wasn't necessarily on purpose, like I said before, but they're still there, and they're still operating our lives. And so the only 5% of our lives are from the conscious mind. And so what we need to do today is switch that around so that we look at those 95% of our lives' thoughts, decide which ones we don't want, and then change it. And that's doable.
That was the big revelation you had when
Yes.
you got into your erroneous self.
I did. Yeah, my erroneous self for sure. You know, my whole, I went through the mind control from the experiments, but then I also had all this other programming that came in at the same time. So when I saw myself doing, having knee-jerk reactions to things that were completely overboard, and I started getting to the point where I noticed that that was going on, and I also didn't seem to have any control over it. And so someone would say something innocent, and I would completely overreact and go, just kind of fly off the wall with either having my feelings hurt or being angry or some kind of wild way of dealing with what they said that had nothing to do with what they said. So
This could be an effect of post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
I think so, yeah. And so I realized that I saw that that's what I was doing, and I wanted to change that, and I didn't know how. And by the time I came across that one book that said I have control over my mind and what I'm thinking, then I thought, okay, so the books that I had read on how the brain works didn't help. So maybe this will. If this is true, then maybe this will. And then as serendipity would have it, because I think universe is hearing us all the time and saying, okay, well, this person's really serious about this. So here's this little nudge, or here's this little gift.
Hey, take that to heart, folks. I'm just telling the listening audience, take that to heart, folks. The universe is speaking to you. And I will stand strong saying I have never gone looking for any of this information. It came looking for me.
Exactly.
So that was a very critical point you just made. Even though it sounds so simple, the answers are trying to find us.
Answers are trying to find us because their answers are in the universal mind. And so, because the mind, is not in the brain, like a lot of scientists may think. So we're living within universal mind. And so when you're serious about doing something or making a change, especially when it's a change like what we're talking about here, you will receive something that will help you along your way. And it comes in all different forms and fashions. Mine was, I was working for an engineering construction firm at the time, and I was asking these questions internally because it wasn't something I wanted to talk to anybody about. And then all of a sudden, one day, my boss came to me and said, we just got a contract that's going to require some of our staff to know computer programming. Would you be interested in taking a class on computer programming? I said, oh, sure, I'd love it. So I'm in there taking computer programming classes. And as I'm doing that, I'm seeing the correlation between how software is programmed and how our brains are programmed. And so
kind of the if then go to this.
Exactly. So I thought, if a computer can be programmed to do something, then maybe I could reprogram my brain. That was my first thought. And so I thought about that for quite a little while. And then I got to realizing that, if I were to try to rewrite the code in my brain, that's almost an impossible task because there's too many and I don't know where they all are. And, I don't even know how I would start doing that. And then I thought, well, I need to find something that's simple, because you can't go, if you're going to do something like what I was proposing to do, what my theory was, my theory was that, that if I could reprogram my brain and use a different part of my brain to change things, then maybe the other part of my brain, if I wasn't using it long enough, it would atrophy and then it wouldn't be able to work. That was my theory. And so the idea of reprogramming my brain, I thought about that for a long time and couldn't figure out how to do it. And then while I was thinking about it one day, all of a sudden, I get this idea. It came out of nowhere. Why don't I just think of something really simple, some kind of key phrase to remind me that this is what I'm doing. And so I came up with a key phrase. I have to back up a bit and talk about these entities again. So, because it all ties together. So if I get a little scattered, just reel me back in.
That's all right. Bring it on home.
So I needed to find a key phrase, something simple that I could remember in the midst of, being bombarded, being overreactive or any of those kinds of things, being negative. I was living in negativity. And so I knew that by then I knew that the thoughts that I was getting, I didn't know they were entities yet, but I knew that the thoughts that I was getting were not my thoughts. And so I thought, well, okay, so they're not my thoughts, so they're not true. And even if they are true, I can say they're not true because they're not mine. They're not really how I feel. And so I started out with the simple phrase of that's a lie. And I took it from there, which we can talk about, in detail whenever you want. But I reprogrammed my brain literally to stop using the negative thoughts that were coming in and making the decision to use another part of my brain on purpose. And so it took a long, long time of trial and error to do that reprogramming, but it eventually worked. So now it's easier for other people to do it because I can shortcut the trial and error part and give them exactly what actually did work. So what I ended up doing was changing a lot of that 95% of subconscious programming, video recording, and changing that to where I'm not doing those things anymore. I'm not even thinking of those things anymore. I can't do those things anymore. The brain doesn't fire that way anymore. And so I'm living more of my life consciously than ever before. Well, when you start doing that, everything in your world changes, which is another validation of just how powerful our minds are.
Right. Exactly. I mean, that's the whole gimmick, right? They have us battling a materialistic realm, and the true answer comes from within.
Well, it does, and that's a simple way to say it, and we know what that means. But to actually do it is another whole story.
Absolutely. Well, we still have 15, 18 minutes here. So if you want to continue, I was gonna bring you over to some of the lessons learned. Mm-hmm. 96, you founded the Patrick Crusade. Mm-hmm. People aligned to replace injustice and cruelty with knowledge. Mm-hmm. And this was a prison reform attempt in some ways, right?
It was a prison and court reform.
Right. But I think you discovered the problem. And so in discussing how the Patrick Crusade kind of failed is a way of showing success, the success story. I'm not saying that your crusade failed, but you were definitely brought to the point where you were saying, wait a minute, I'm busy with the symptoms. This isn't the cause.
Exactly.
I'm attempting to mask the symptoms. So I think the Patrick Crusade is a great example for people to see where we're at now in the materialistic battle and where we need to go to understand how we can actually change the paradigm.
Yeah, the Patrick Crusade was at one time the human rights organization, and there were millions of people around the world who were following that. And so we were really, really active until 2009 when my husband was killed. And when that happened, I took a good hard look at the work that the Patrick Crusade had done. And we'd done some really fantastic things, don't get me wrong. I mean, we helped an awful lot of people. But the system wasn't changing. It was just that we were able to help this person and that person and so on. But the general system was not changing at all. And so when Patrick, my husband, was killed, I took a long look at everything and realized that, wait a minute, I really am just working the whole Patrick Crusade and all that effort, good as it is and as important as it is to do. It is just the tip of the iceberg of a major problem that we have worldwide. And it all boils down to this negative energy that we're living within. It's like the whole planet is showered with this stuff. And we don't need to wallow in it. It's there, but we can walk right through it, but we don't know that. So yeah, the lesson for me was a huge one. It doesn't really sound huge maybe, but just seeing that whole, as bad as the prison system is in the United States, I mean, we incarcerate more people here in the United States than any other country in the world. And if people have the idea that, oh, well, it's 3 free meals and a cot and you're fine, they're really deluding themselves. Because it's brutal in those prisons. It's kind of like some of the movies that you see where there's always a guy that's getting beat up on or something, but it's even worse than that. Some of the stories, I wish Patrick lived long enough to write a book about some of the things that he saw in there.
Yeah, unimaginably overpopulated, 6 men to 4 men cells. 30 people to a 24-man room, just people in there for nonviolent, these people don't need to be behind cages. And then they're put into this state of constant fear because you are surrounded by violent criminals. And I mean, I grew up in one of the very first police states in Winter Park, Florida. In Orlando, Florida was the very first police state. We had cameras, we had cops, every single person in my high school knew the judges by name.
Yeah.
Right? We're like, oh God, you got that judge, you're screwed. We at 15 years old, and honestly, I had developed so many voices in my head of terror and fear and paranoia as I would drive around, waiting to be picked off by those sharks, by these entities that were swimming around in police cars just waiting to take me out.
You got it.
It was so frightening all my life because I've been traumatized. I've been in and out. I've been incarcerated. I've been, on probation. I've been on everybody. The motto in Florida was come to Florida on vacation, wind up on probation, get flown back on a violation. This is something we all knew in high school. Yeah. So the very trauma of just constantly being under this police state is one thing. And it drove me insane to the point while the whole time I was on my subconscious mind driving my vehicle, my subconscious mind was constantly thinking out the scenario in the maladaptive daydreaming of what I was going to have to say to that officer in order to explain my position. And I was in this state of mind at all times. And I finally just fled. I ran out of Florida just to get away from that, from my mind being so paranoid. And I found myself in Lawrence, Kansas, where there are no police. There's nothing going on like that. Cops are all just, Andy Griffith. And all of a sudden, those voices were all gone. The paranoia, my body rested for the first time. I had no idea I was under all this trauma. No idea until I'd found the opposite.
Well, see, now you just having that personal experience, and you were outside the prisons at least the majority of the time, right? But you still had that fear, and so when you compound that with the 30 guys in a room for 26, and you've got the nonviolent criminals, offenders. I won't even call them prisoners, but the offenders, but nonviolent people being put into prison and jails. And then they're combined with the very violent.
Yeah, imagine me locked behind bars.
Oh
I
my
mean,
God.
really?
So,
I mean, come on.
yeah. So if the fear that's generated is amazing, and the general negative. I used to go to the prisons, and I visited Patrick, and so it's like a wall that you walk through. It's like a curtain that you walk through between positive or just normal combination positive negative into this all negative environment, and you can feel it. At least I could feel it. It was a huge difference. And so even in the visiting room where everybody's being cordial and on their best behavior and things like that, you could still feel the fear of the guards standing there watching your every move and listening to your every word. Heaven's sakes, you wouldn't ever want to say anything that would offend them, or not only would you get kicked out, but whoever you were visiting would get severely punished. So it's a brutal place. And when I was looking at this, I realized, wait a minute, I understand why this is a brutal place. This is like a feeding ground for these negative energy, these negative entities. They have a feast, a buffet every moment of the day, so they do not want anything changing that environment. They love that environment. Well, they're influencing the administrators, the guards, and on up the food chain, literally food chain, to the top commissioner of the prisons. They're all influenced on one level or another by these entities to not make a change in that prison system. Give you an example. The program that Jerry Marzinski introduced to help people who were addicted get off of it, he and his wife developed it so that it was virtually free to operate, so no cost to the prisons. He programmed it so that it would run off of really old throwaway computers, so that they wouldn't have to go buy new computers, and those could just be donated. And it was a program that the prisoners could not infiltrate or hack or anything like that, so that they would actually benefit from it. And so when the prisons found out just how well this program was working, they pulled the plug. They didn't want that program in there.
Wow.
Now, if it hadn't been doing any good and just costing a whole bunch of money, they probably would have let it through.
Right.
See, they don't want improvement. Now, there's always exceptions to that rule. In everything that I say, there's always an exception where maybe there's a prison somewhere on the planet that's actually helping people, rehabilitate from whatever it is that they did to get there. But you don't see it here in the United States. At least in every state that the Patrick Crusade dealt with, we never saw that.
There's no reform. I mean, nobody's trying to make these people better people.
No, the recidivism rate is, I forget now, I think it's like up around 65 or 70%, where people get out of prison and 65 or 75% of them are back in within 2 or 3 years.
Right, because we're not shifting the problem. We're not trying to find the answers here. We're dealing with symptoms. And if you get into works like David McGowan, may he rest in peace, poor guy. I hate that we lost him. But David McGowan, who you can listen to on this show, discussing the satanic ramifications of the prison and court systems.
Exactly.
And I mean, that book will scare the life out of you.
Yeah, unless you've been there and know that that's true. I mean, I don't know how much time we've got left, but I know that on Patrick's case, we proved him to be completely innocent of the crime that he was in prison for. His was actually he had been a police officer, and
This
he
is
was
your husband that you're talking
yeah, and he was undercover doing undercover work, and so he got the evidence on 2 high officials in Alabama for drug smuggling and racketeering. And so he turned that into the federal government. They were convicted for those crimes and sent to federal prison for 10 years. Well, when they got out, they set up they actually framed him for a double murder. And we proved, and he was sent to prison for life without parole. If you read the transcripts, and reading transcripts is never any fun, but read the trial transcripts and then reconstruct. We had forensic scientists reconstruct the whole crime scene based on the trial, right? And when they did that, they realized and they proved that there's no way that the crime could have happened the way they said it did in court. These things defy the laws of physics. So it was gross. It was gross. Nobody looked into this right off the bat, and so I started looking into it and really doing some serious digging about it. Came across Universe handed me these forensic scientists. One of them told me that most of his work was with the FBI. He very seldom took private cases, but he saw this case and he called to volunteer to take on this case.
Nice.
And then another one was a retired CIA guy, and I had always heard once CIA, always CIA, so you don't trust him. But he offered to look into this case, and I thought, well, he can't do any more harm than already done, so go ahead. And so he did, and he went at it from the point of view of proving that he was guilty. And so he tried to prove that he was guilty, and he couldn't.
Right.
And this was a guy that worked counterintelligence over in Russia during the war. So, he was no slouch, and he was frustrated as could be because he couldn't find him guilty. Well, then that's important, but it's not nearly as important as the 2 forensic scientists finding that it was impossible for him to have committed that crime. So then you look at how the courts did their thing to get him convicted. They're so corrupt. We showed them the evidence of the proof, and they refused to hear it. That's all they had to do.
Right.
That's totally against the law, but it doesn't matter because it's Alabama. I don't know. But so it didn't matter. The one news reporter who was thrilled about this because it was a breaking news story, she did a story, and then she called me a few days later. She wasn't in Alabama anymore. She called me from somewhere else, and I'm not going to say where, even after all these years. Excuse me. But she got fired, and she got threatened to not touch that case anymore. And she was scared, so she left the state. So this was, because it was dealing with mafia-type drug groups, you don't mess with those guys. I mean, because, you can get killed real easy, and it'll be suicided, But instead, they wanted Patrick to suffer for his crime. His crime was getting them put behind bars, because that doesn't happen very often. So
Exactly.
the experience in prison for him was a huge eye opener for me. And he was looking at all this stuff from the eyes of a police officer who really did care about people. He was one of the few who did. And so he ended up helping a lot of people in there straighten out their lives.
Right.
And
but yet the world is in turmoil.
yeah.
And this absolutely has me thinking of poor Corey Feldman, who has been on his truth campaign for some time now. And most recent reports from Corey was that he was stabbed and he is in the hospital. Well, it turns out he was stabbed not by a knife, but by a syringe. And so as the police tried to find the puncture wound in his belly, somebody seemed to have opened Corey Feldman's car door, stabbed him with a syringe, and ran off. Corey went straight to the hospital. He's under investigation to see what has been possibly injected to him. Trying to show the police what had happened, they looked at his belly and, of course, could not find a puncture wound. I mean, the world as it is today, when we have our actors coming forward, Corey Feldman fighting for Corey Haim, talking about the ritual sex abuse that constantly goes on in Hollywood. We have Katy Perry fighting to own a convent by these poor 90-year-old nuns that she is basically throwing out into the streets, and they are not getting anything after Katy said that she had sold her soul to Satan. Lady Gaga is blaming her fibromyalgia on the Illuminati demons that she now has obtained by joining them. And if we go all the way back to Anna Nicole and her mysterious death and the courtroom battles over her body and her baby, very bizarre. Michael Jackson's body was moved in the middle of the night. Whitney Houston's body and her daughter's, Whitney Houston drowned in the bathtub, and her body was kept in the room while a party was happening for all of Hollywood's celebrities. And currently, stacks of love letters are being sent to Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland school shooter, is receiving an overwhelming amount of love letters coming in.
Oh my.
For why, I'm not sure.
Yeah. It's such a crazy world that it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, the things you're reading are just bizarre, crazy things that it's hard for a person to think, well, anything other than the whole world has gone upside down and insane.
Exactly.
You know, looking at it from my point of view, from my eyes, which I know I see the world from different eyes because I came from a different place. I mean, from a different upbringing. And so I would naturally see the world a little differently than most people. But still, you know, you get to this particular point where you're looking at all this craziness and the world really is turned upside down and insane.
Well, I want to dig into this much deeper with you on the other side as we get more into these hive mind entities and the invading thoughts and what we can do about that. We're going to definitely dig deep into that into the second hour and look at our holographic universe and realize that life goes beyond the brain. And once you learn the skills of reprogramming your brain, that's what shifts the paradigm.
It does, exactly. And I'll talk about exactly how to do that.
Fantastic. So if you aren't members yet, get on over to freemantv.com and subscribe. Not only do you get the bonus hours, which is amazing, and you get much more personalized information because we feel off the record inside the members section. It's just us and the little family. It's really nice, and we can talk about whatever we want without fear. And not only are you getting that by becoming a subscriber, but you are also sponsoring this show. So, you know, this show costs money. I have to pay to keep it online and keep things going. So you are sponsoring the free portion to give to the world. So not only do you get the members' content, but you are a sponsor of this program. And that way I don't have to deal with sponsors, because sponsors are the devil. And they are the ones blocking all the information that you want to get. This is why I'm banned from YouTube, why I'm blackballed from coast to coast, why I'm getting blocked on Twitter, is sponsors, right? So forget the sponsors, folks. I need you. And because we live now in this collective mind, now that we have this almost type 1 civilization where we are globally communicative, it doesn't take a lot of effort to support efforts these days. I mean, you may feel apologetic for sending $1, but if 30,000 people are sending $1, then you sent me too much. Send me a quarter. That's how this all works, and that's the new programming we've got to get into, is that minimum input, maximum output. Don't apologize for giving a little amount, because there are all of us putting this together, and it should be easy for all of us to change our world. This is not supposed to be a difficult task, and that's the real key that Sherry Swiney and I are going to get into, is that it doesn't take all this effort to change the paradigm. It takes you becoming a new you and finding this new self and staying, as Sherry is showing, in your conscious mind, and not letting that 95% of maladaptive daydreaming get in your way. Because there are invading entities, invading thoughts, pretending to be you, telling you all the worst things you never wanted to hear. Any final thoughts on that, Sherry?
Oh, perfectly said, Freeman. That's you said it really, really well, that they are pretending to be you. I remember one time I asked, who are you? And the answer that I got is, we are you. I'm like, okay, so I'm not a we, I'm an I. That's one thing. So, and these thoughts that I'm hearing or feeling are not things that I would normally think. But they even will say, we are you. So they're morons, really. But we'll get into that later.
Exactly. That's you know exactly where I want to go. So get over to keyholejourney.com. This is a long-running website going well back into the 90s, and you can tell by the GIF. I got to give you a little bit of crap on that, Sherry. I'll hook you up with my Alonzo. Alonzo Pichardo is my web host. I'll see if we can't get you up into the 21st century on that. But it is an amazing website, folks. The Keyhole Journey, beyond the appearance. And I'm sorry to harp on you about that, but it's my job.
Harp away.
The depth of knowledge that is withheld in this website is just beyond, and you need to dig in deep. There are 11 years of the prison studies. There are deep insights into the archonic minds that are influencing us. It began with the Patrick Crusade. It began with the understanding of trying to release people from the programming that is leading them into prison, and it turned into an understanding of how this mind control program is working, what the Nazis and Jesuits always knew, and even how far back this really goes into ancient Sanskrit writings and everything. So get over to keyholejourney.com and dig deep into all the work that Sherry has provided there. And, of course, you will also find the work of Jerry Marzinski there. So there's even more. And we're trying so hard to understand these hive mind entities that are influencing our thoughts. And now that we're getting into questions beyond the brain and in the holographic universe, we can start to actually put terms to these things. And once you start to understand, that's when the paradigm shifts. It's that simple. It's not going out and battling these entities. So we're going to dig deep into how-to on the other side. So I hope you all will come over to freemantv.com and subscribe and help sponsor this program to get out to all the millions of people out there around the world. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you're a member, I'll see you on the other side. The rest of you, I will see you all next week.